Breaking news: the basic discordance between Democratic senators' condemnations of Israel. The number of Palestinian civilian casualties in the ongoing Israeli offensive against Hamas is rising, and among those who identify as supporters of Israel, a new line of thinking is developing. Israel has the right to defend itself, but it needs to do more to prevent civilian deaths. The war waged by Israel against Hamas is just, but it must be conducted justly, stated Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat Maryland, in an op-ed piece published last week in the Washington Post. Produce a verifiable plan to reduce the unacceptable level of civilian casualties in Gaza, he demands of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, urging American officials to do the same. It is Israel's obligation under the laws of war to protect innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza, as Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat Massachusetts, put it, in addition to its right to defend its citizens from Hamas terrorist attacks. In a Senate speech last week, she claimed that Israel is conducting military operations with little regard for civilian life. She went on to mention the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, where over 15,000 people have been killed and over 40,000 injured. As evidence, there is a basic and maybe insurmountable gulf between these arguments, though. Advocating for Israel's right to self-defense entails implicitly supporting the deaths of innocent bystanders. Fatalities will be high when forces invade Gaza to dismantle a terrorist group that has spent the past 15 years building a political and military infrastructure among the civilian population. Thousands would still perish in Gaza even if everything went according to plan. It is a fact that many of Israel's supporters and detractors fail to acknowledge. Attempts to absolve oneself of the moral reproach of endorsing a policy that will invariably result in the loss of innocent lives are analogous to claims that Israel should engage in less lethal forms of warfare. A coworker once told me that it's like wanting to avoid the bad aspects of war, civilian casualties, in favor of the good ones, killing Hamas militants. A lot of people in the West, including those who support Israel, are having a hard time dealing with the moral quandaries that this war has brought about. The conflict in Gaza is reminiscent of the terrible wars that happened in the past, and the enemy is both brutal and incredibly uncaring about the suffering of its own people. The critics of Israel are not without merit. It is highly likely that the Israeli Defense Forces have relaxed their rules of engagement in Gaza in comparison to earlier conflicts. A recent article in the Washington Post mentioned that during meetings between U.S. and Israeli officials, the method Israeli forces used to determine the worth of individual militant targets and the threshold for acceptable collateral damage was brought up. They did, however, note that the United States standards are lower than Israel's. The current conflict has resulted in a higher rate of civilian casualties than Israel's previous wars in Gaza, according to a report published last week in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. The fact that Israel is launching a far larger military operation than before contributes to this. Israel has tolerated and even encouraged Hamas' presence in Gaza in past conflicts in an effort to degrade them. Right now, Israel wants Hamas gone entirely. A foreign policy analyst at the Israeli think tank Mitvim, Yonatan Tuvel, has stated that the IDF could and should demonstrate more regard for civilian life, that more can and should be done. Recalling that in recent days, some of the freed hostages have testified that while they were in Gaza, they felt that the IDF had no idea what it was bombing and that some of the places they were in were bombed, which the IDF would obviously not have done had it known that. He draws attention to this fact. Tuvel, however, counters the claims made by Warren, Van Hollen, and others by stating they have no idea what war is. Ultimately, what standard should be used to evaluate Van Hollen's claim that the present number of civilian casualties is unacceptable? Was the loss of 10,000 lives in Gaza considered acceptable? Why not try 12,000? When asked about the widespread criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza, just war expert Michael Walzer said, "It seems clear that disproportionate just means any number that horrifies me." Walzer notes that a paradox is developing in Gaza. While Israel wants to reduce civilian casualties, Hamas wants them increased. The group's top brass has absolved themselves of any blame for Palestinian casualties and has even hinted that regular Palestinians must give their lives if they want to destroy Israel. Hamas's decision to conceal its military infrastructure among civilians is not coincidental. Global satellites capture the tragic images of innocent Palestinians buried under piles of rubble, their parents' wails in anguish over the bodies of their children. Instead of expressing outrage at Hamas for putting the lives of the people it claims to be fighting for in jeopardy, the focus is on Israel. Israel is being further pressured to scale down its military operations as a result of this. It would be considerably more difficult for Israel to carry out the war against Hamas if it were guilty of what its critics often claim, the indiscriminate killing of Palestinians or committing genocide. Indeed, set aside concerns about legality or morality, Israel achieves nothing strategically by indiscriminately murdering Palestinians. Additionally, the haze of war makes it difficult to determine whether Israel's actions are justified or whether adequate measures are taken to safeguard civilians. Destroying an apartment building that houses a Hamas terrorist leader while killing dozens of innocent civilians will appear disproportionate and heartless to many on the outside. It is difficult to determine whether such an action is permissible under international law without knowing the leader's status, the significance of his elimination to Israel, and the information Israeli officials had regarding the number of civilians in the building at the time. The idea of a democratic nation going to war with a neighboring enemy bent on destroying and eradicating it is simply not part of the modern warfare playbook, which complicates matters in the Gaza war. This kind of conflict has never been seen or compared to before in modern times. Over the course of the seemingly endless war that raged in the Middle East from 2001 to 2021, American forces battled far from home. Furthermore, we have grown to assume that non-democratic regimes, like Russia in Ukraine or the Syrian civil war, will not take any measures to prevent harming innocent civilians, while Western democracies are expected to do their utmost to do so. Israel is confronting a challenge that Western nations have never encountered before, both in terms of the closeness of the threat posed by Hamas and the genuinely evil character of that threat. Few Western leaders since World War II have had to make the moral decisions that this conflict brings. The deaths of Israeli soldiers, Hamas militants, or Palestinian civilians are inevitable outcomes of every decision taken by Israeli leaders. The very real prospect of additional October 7s in the future necessitates taking action to eliminate the threat posed by Hamas. Making locks on airplane cockpit doors mandatory was one simple way the United States could protect itself from a repeat of the 9/11 attacks. We need something far worse and more lethal if we don't want another October 7th. Thousands of innocent people have been killed by the United States military in recent conflicts, despite the fact that American lawmakers spend a lot of money and focus on protecting civilians. Tragically, thousands of innocent people will lose their lives in Gaza, despite the fact that Israel could take measures to reduce the number of casualties. A dangerous misconception regarding the nature of war is on display when one seeks to separate themselves from the consequences of supporting Israel's right to self-defense. The Israeli assault on Gaza is absolutely atrocious. It can't be diluted in any way. However, the question of whether the horrific is essential is something that many of Israel's detractors find difficult to accept. From a moral standpoint, there are far too many people who want both sides of an issue.